Today I'd like to go a bit further with the idea that the best way to explain psychology and therapy is with the classical motif of good versus evil, as in all the stories. If if you were, of course, to stand up in a lecture hall and try to give a lecture to professionals in the field and make such a claim, um, you would give them all a great laugh, that's for sure. That's the one thing you can be sure of, they'd have a very good laugh, because it doesn't sound the way we think it should sound. It doesn't sound um, proper and scientific. It sounds completely stupid. It's like going back hundreds of years back into superstition, perhaps, and before science ever came about. But this isn't the case, as we can easily find out when we go into it a bit more. And when we go into it a bit more, we find that we can redefine good and evil, so that instead of becoming concrete labels, they become metaphors. So what we could say is, in our first step to try and go a bit further with this, we could say instead of good and evil, we could talk about truth and deceit, or truth and lies. And we could say that the idea here is that there's something very important for us to know or be aware of, and that the principle of deceit functions by stopping us being aware of it. So we don't know anything about it at all. We don't even know that it's there. So what could that possibly be, we might ask? What could be this thing that is so damn important? And then the answer to that is reality. And I don't think there's going to be many people that would argue against that. Obviously, reality is fairly important. And obviously, if we're completely cut off from it, disconnected from it, alienated from it, that is a bad fate. It's an evil state of affairs, in the sense that it's not going to be good for us, basically, because reality is where all the good stuff comes from. And where else could it come from? And if we are cut off from reality, then by definition we're cut off from the benediction of reality, so to speak. So that gives us a bit of a different way of talking about good and evil. And then our next question might be, well, why would anyone, and how would it happen that we do get deceived from knowing what reality is? Like, we all know what reality is. We can look out of the window, we can watch the news or read the newspapers or whatever. We all know what reality is. So how come there's supposed to be this cosmic principle that acts so as to deceive us about it? That, again, that sounds like some sort of cosmic mischief, but it doesn't sound scientific. But then when we look into it a bit more, we can see that from a psychological point of view, we can see that the whole of human life comes about because of this way in which we get out of touch with reality and think other things are reality that aren't reality. So the whole adventure or experiment of being human beings really is the experiment of going adrift from reality and going in the opposite direction, even though there is no opposite direction. There can still subjectively seem to be. So there is this going adrift or going astray kind of thing that happens. We can look at this in terms of hyperreality if we wanted to. So Baudrillard says that this is exactly what hyperreality does. It successfully does away with reality, does away with the need for reality. And yet at the same time, it's a vastly inferior product that can't give us anything at all, apart from keep on spinning us on and on and on, promising us amazing stuff, because that's its gimmick, to promise us amazing stuff. It's like advertising. So we could do a bit of research into hyperreality, even though we don't really need to because we're stuck in the middle of the hyperreal, and say, okay, the replacing a reality with a hyperreal is a perfect example of this going astray. It's a very good example. And once we cotton on to what's meant by this phrase or this term, we can see that this is very, very pertinent to our lives. It's what goes on the whole time. And in essential, it comes about because of our way of describing things. Well, it comes about because of the way that our descriptions have this uncanny power to, after a while, pretend that they are the things that's being described. So our descriptions take the place of the described, or our thoughts about something take the place of that thing. And this is talked about a lot in Buddhism, where it's said that thought has this property of proliferating totally madly. So one thought splits up into six, and each of those split up into six, and it all explodes into a massive proliferation of thoughts, and each thought is pretending to be reality or mimicking reality or offering a version of reality without telling us that it's a version. So we get sucked into this never-ending jungle of misleading appearances, which in the East is pretty much what they mean by samsara. So samsara, if we want to adopt that term, is the principle whereby reality is obscured without us knowing it. So it is a very widespread and very familiar kind of an idea. Whether we want to call it the realm of the hyperreal or samsara, it doesn't make any difference. So what I'd like to do is just spend a few more moments talking about the mythological end of this, and then move over to the connection with science, in particular thermodynamics and quantum theory, just to try to show that the two things are saying the same thing, really. So a really good example to pick in the good versus evil thing is the ancient Persian religion of Zoroastrianism, which is probably the first really, really big dualist religion. Dual, good versus evil, or truth versus the principle of deception. It's very, very clear. This tension is very, very clear in Zoroastrianism, and the messages in Zoroastrianism are much more clear, I think, than other religions. I think it is still a living religion, but in Iran, so I've been told. But in its time, it was big. It was predates Islam and Christianity. And just to kind of give a flavour of where this dualism is coming from, there's a story which I kind of roughly know, and the story is that there's this kind of proto-god, of ancient god, whose name is Zervan, I think, and his consort, his wife, is pregnant with twins, and he's delighted, and he's walking around and looking forward to his sons being born, because he knows they're sons. Being a god, he doesn't need ultrasound, he just knows they're sons. So he's very excited about that. It's a kind of monumental event. He hasn't got any kids, and now he's got kids, and his missus is due to give birth soon. So he's walking up and down, and he kind of says, unwisely as it turns out, he makes a promise, and he says, the first twin to be born shall have dominion over this earth for however long, 8,000 years or longer. I can't remember. It's a very long time anyway. This is my promise. He shall have dominion. He shall take on from me. So one of the two twins, the evil twin, who became known as Ahriman, hears this. Evil never sleeps, and he's listening, even though he's only not even born yet. So he hears this, and he thinks, here's my chance. And he kind of rips open his mother's stomach, causing her to die on the spot, because he's big and fearsome. Jumps out and stands before his father and says, okay, old man, I win the race, I'm first, hand it over. And Zervan's in a total state of shock, and he's looking at him, and he kind of says something like, well, but my son is fragrant and good looking and of noble countenance, and you stink like hell, and even when I look at you, I kind of want to heave straight away. That's how foul you are. You're kind of like an abomination or something. I'm not going to hand over dominion of the earth to you. But Ahriman says, you promised, you've got no choice, hand it over. And when a god promises like that, they have to stand by the promise. They're not like human beings in that regard. It's part of their integrity of a god. He had to stand by his promise, so he handed over total dominion of the earth to Ahriman, the principle of darkness and lies and deceit and general badness. So ever since, there has been this dynamic tension between the god of light, who is the other twin, Ahura Mazda, and Ahriman, only with the proviso that Ahriman is firmly in charge. He's holding the reins, which is a common theme in Christianity. It's said that Satan is the prince of this world by Jesus on a number of occasions. And to this day, Jehovah's Witnesses will say that earth belongs to Satan. And so did the Cathars. They used to say that as well, that the visible realm, the material or tangible realm, is the rightful dominion of Satan. So we find this idea echoed in a lot of places. So the way this dynamism or opposition, apparent opposition, because it's all part of the game, as Alan Watts says, plays out, is that when every human being is born, it's as if the principle of light and the principle of darkness are playing for their soul. Only it's not really a question of souls, because souls don't come into it. But they're striving to influence the life of that individual. And of the two, the principle of darkness is more overt in its striving and stronger and louder. That being the nature of evil. The nature of light is such that it's there, but it can't make itself known. It's not aggressive in that way. its voice is not so loud, as I was saying in the previous instalment. So it's like there's a bet going on for each person between Ahriman and Ahura Mazda as to who will win this little contest. Each one of us is thrown out there, and nobody knows which way it's going to go. Ahriman does his very best to lead us astray and prevent us from ever seeing the truth, or seeing what reality is, or seeing who we are, more importantly, maybe. And then what happens is if he is winning the game, he keeps the person tied up forever in bullshit, basically. Keeps them strung along and strung along and strung along, missing everything that is of value and worth to them, causing them to neglect what is of actual worth to them by stringing them on, and eventually they die. So he says, that's one for me. He wins that match, and Ahriman wins 99.9% of the time, really, in as much as we live and die preoccupied with things that don't really matter to us, wasting our time, giving our attention to constructs and playing the game that's been given to us to play, as if some good will come out of it, when of course it won't, because the only point of the game is to distract us from doing anything else until it's too late, and then we can't. So this idea as well has resonance with Buddhism and early Christianity, particularly Gnostic Christianity. So this gives us a way of looking at the meaning in inverted commas, since we have to be careful about talking about meaning, but the meaning of each human life, what the forces are acting on the human life, and whether it can take us one way where Ahriman succeeds, and if Ahriman succeeds, then that's bad for us. And we can see that it's bad for us. We know that it's bad for us anyway, but we can see that it's bad for us by what Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas, where he says, if you bring forth what is within you, then what is within you will save you. And if you don't bring forth what is within you, then what is within you will destroy you. So Ahriman's brief is to stop us realizing our potential, or being creative, or finding out who we really are. So that's the mythological end of things. And we could still say, well, that's all very nice, but where's the hard science? Like, we all love hard science, even though, I say, we don't really know what hard science actually is. It's not facts and figures and research and all that stuff, which is just pseudoscience, really. That's just the trappings of science, as people have often commented. Because real science doesn't actually explain everything in concrete terms, even though it does look into things in an unprejudiced way, which is very, very hard for humans to do anything in an unprejudiced way, since our very nature is the nature of prejudice. The ego itself is a prejudice. Our belief systems are all prejudices. Our programming and conditioning is prejudice. So it's very hard for us to be truly scientific. But just to briefly go into the more contemporary scientific way of looking at this, we could say that reality itself is what we could call radical uncertainty. And from the point of view of quantum theory, we know this because we know that what happens, that prior to all determinate states, there's an indeterminate state. And so, giving the example of Schrödinger's cat, which we all know, we can say that until we actually open the chamber and find out whether the cat's been killed or not, the cat, in quantum theory terms, hasn't made up its mind whether it's alive or dead, so it's both alive and dead, and it sees no contradiction between being alive and dead at the same time, because in an uncollapsed quantum state like that, they're both equally okay. But then as soon as we decide, then it has to be one and it can't be any other. So the universe, before it collapsed or decided which way it was going to fall, like a ball falling in a roulette wheel as it's slowing down, it decides, goes for one possibility instead of just being a blur of possibilities. Beforehand, it's a bit like Schrodinger's cat in the sense that it hasn't made up its mind, not whether it's alive or dead, but hasn't made up its mind in any regard whatsoever about anything, any possibilities at all. So it's undecided. It's an undecided state. It could be anything, and yet it is nothing, and yet everything is within it. And that we could say is reality, because it comes before everything else, because everything else is a collapse of that, an analogue of that, something that comes out of it, and by coming out of it and being definite excludes all other possibilities. So we could say, okay, well, obviously that we can call that reality. So what happens is there is this great tendency for the undecided state of radical uncertainty to collapse or lose information. So what we're talking about here is cosmic information loss, a total collapse of information to produce the physical universe, which is just one concretized possibility. And the way it works when there's one concretized possibility is that when you find yourself in that possibility, all other possibilities have been excluded. You can't know about them or intuit them or anything. And the reason, and that's the very reason that a determinate reality is created, by the exclusion of all else. And that's also how thought works. We focus on one thing and we can only focus on it by excluding everything else. We don't want to think of everything. Well, we don't want to be aware of everything all at once. If you ever made the experiment of being aware of everything all at once, then you'd find that you're back in original symmetry. You're back in the uncollapsed state, which you could also say is the same as saying that you're conscious, instead of being trapped in one single possibility and thinking that that single possibility is the be all and the end all. So saying that helps us to see that this whole principle of truth and deception, formlessness and form, and the whole cosmological process of how the universe is created, how the physical, tangible universe is created, lends itself very much to this whole idea of truth versus deception. All forms are deception, because there are no forms, because really nothing is separate or distinguished from anything else. And yet our attention is trapped, stuck to the world of forms, stuck to forms. Forms are all we know, names are all we know. Names and forms. And anything that hasn't got a name or form, we flatly refuse to acknowledge as existing. And if someone comes up to us and says, yeah, like there's this thing that it has no form and it has no name and you can't measure it or do research on it, but it's real, you'll get laughed out of town. Because we're caught up in the deception. So, of course, we're going to laugh when someone tries to tell us it is a deception. Okay, thanks for watching.